Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study through the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in Numbers chapter 27. Now, these are the last days of Moses, of the first generation, that generation that came out of Egypt. And because of their unbelief, God had pronounced judgment on them that they would die in the wilderness. So at this time now, pretty much all of them have died, except Joshua and Caleb, who were, because of their faithfulness, was promised to go into the land, and we will see that they will go into the land. Moses himself will not go into the land because what is interesting, in the 38th year, he sinned against God when he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock as God commanded him. We'll come back to that later because Moses is going to plead with God to let him go into the land. All right. So a lot of the so from here to the end of the book of Moses, some of them obviously I'm going to kind of gloss over because they're last minute re-emphasizing of the command he's given them. And then a lot of it, of course, too, what we focus on is the kind of some of the events and instructions that God will have Moses do for the children of Israel. So, all right. So, Numbers chapter 27, verse 1 says, "The daughters of Zelophehad approached." Zelophehad was the son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Marshi, son of Manasseh, from the clan of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. Now these were the names of his daughters. Now, kind of interesting situation here. It's interesting and more, of course, to the Jewish heritage, which we will see will play out. This will actually play out in two parts. This is the first part, and then actually the last chapter of Numbers is the second part to that. But of course, during this time, especially when it came to inheritance, and how God had set up the inheritance, these daughters are going to make a case, and then people are going to come back later and say, okay, well, what about this? And so this is a couple of things that are extremely important. Ancestry, genealogy was important to the Jews. They were also important to, of course, the biblical narrative, in that it was important to distinguish which was the line of Jesus and which wasn't. All right. So these were the names of the daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Haglah, Micah, and Tirzan. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the leaders of the entire community at the entrance of the tents of the meeting, and said, now remember, Aaron has died, Miriam has died, and pretty much the last of the whole generation. So these are all new elders. Other than Joshua and Caleb, and of course Moses, but Moses, this is, like I said, we're going into the last days of Moses. Okay, so from this point, maybe a couple of weeks, it's not clear. By the time we get to the Numbers, it would be literally the last days. But the oldest person probably in the camp now is around 60 years old. All right. So verse 3 says, our father died in the wilderness, but he was not among Korah's followers who gathered together against the Lord. Instead, he died because of his own sin, and he had no sons. Now, kind of a sidebar thing here. Remember, there are literally lots of stuff that happens where we don't have his narrative. In other words, his death is recent, right? Within just the last year. Remember when Numbers switched over, we jumped from the second year to the 38th year. But yet you still see things going on that's not reported. So in other words, everything is not important. Remember, the biblical narrative is only focused on God's plan and purpose for Israel through the seed, Jesus. But here's this kind of an interesting thing that comes up in terms of genealogy, but they said, well, he died because of whatever sin that he died of. So verse 4 says, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan, since he had no son, to give us property among our father's brothers? Now, this is going to be very important. We'll see this even later on. This is why genealogy is important. You establish that, if that land and property stayed in a family. In other words, you couldn't really, like today, we could sue and take land away. If you do something to me, or vice versa, I could sue you and take your land. Well, that really couldn't happen in Israel. And remember, it only if there was debt involved, and you could not pay the debt, the land would only kind of be taken away until the year of Jubilee, and then it was kind of reverted back to the original owners. But you have to prove that by genealogy. So, verse 5, Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord answered him, what Zelophehad's daughters say is correct. You are to give them hereditary property among their father's brothers, and transfer their father's inheritance to them. Tell the Israelites, when a man dies without having a son, transfer his inheritance to his daughters. And if he has no daughters, give inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give inheritance to his father's brothers. And if he has no brothers, give the inheritance to the nearest relative of his clan, or the nearest kin, as we kind of know it as, and he will take possession of it. Now, we'll see this later on, by the way, in the case of Ruth and Boaz. It says, this is to be a statutory ordinance to Israel, for the Israelites, as the Lord has commanded. Then the Lord said to Moses, go up to this mountain of Abram range to see the land that I have given the Israelites. After you have seen it, you will also be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother was. And the community crawled in the wilderness of sin. Both of you rebelled against my command to show my holiness in the sight of the waters. These were the waters of Meribah of Kadesh in the wilderness of sin. So Moses appealed to the Lord. May the Lord and the God of the spirits of all flesh appoint a man over the community who will go out before them and come back in before them, and who will bring them out and to bring them in, so that the Lord's community won't be like sheep without a shepherd. Kind of interesting prayer. And I can tell you, God honors these kinds of prayers. I remember praying one time this kind of prayer that I was involved with in the congregation that I was involved with, and they were kind of hoping that I would stay there because the pastor actually was blind. And it's a longer story that I won't get into, but they got attached, and I knew I wasn't going to be in that part of that congregation. But I remember praying and asking God to raise up help for him in the form of a good man, and he did just that. There was another occasion where, and during this time, I was kind of involved with the congregations and stuff and helping them out, and there were both good reasons for that. But again, one of the bad parts of that, you get attached, or people get attached to you. And again, I remember praying and asking God to, send some help, and they did. Now, the better wisdom, I'll tell you, is that I shouldn't have been involved with those churches in that manner, especially if I wasn't going to commit, and I knew I wasn't going to commit. But in the younger days, you always wanted to, you look at any door to be busy. But I digress. But anyway, Moses prayed, and obviously too, God had already had this plan worked out. But notice, and again, with these kinds of prayers, it could be that God places them on our hearts. Sometimes we don't even know that what we're praying is something that God has already placed on our hearts. So, all right, excuse me, verse 18. The Lord replied to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man who has the Spirit in him. You notice the capitalization, meaning the Holy Spirit here. So in the Old Testament, when translators distinguish between just the regular term Spirit and then the Holy Spirit, they always capitalize the Spirit, signifying that this is the Holy Spirit. Verse 19 says, have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole community and commission him in their sight. Confer some of your authority on him so that the entire Israelite communities will obey him. He will stand before Eleazar, who will consult the Lord for him with the decision of the Urim. He and all the Israelites with him, even the entire community, will go out and come back at his command. One of the things, a good practice for the transference of authority, and many churches do this, is to have these public acknowledgement that the transfer of leadership has taken place. And let me just say this, because I kind of made mention of it earlier. One of the reasons why I made mention kind of praying for someone, because when you're younger, at least when I was younger, you always had that desire to want to be in leadership, to teach and to do these things. And if you're doing those things without God's leadership, it's flesh. So some of you younger people, if God is not opening the doors for you, don't try to walk in doors or create doors to walk through. But if God is with you, then God will validate you before the people. And so this was one of the ways that God would validate them. And notice he says that two ways that God would kind of lead them. Through the high priest, and then he said the decision of the Urim. Now the Urim is the little, I don't know how you would say, a little device right there. I mean, kind of like that they would consult, okay? And sometimes the priest would wear it's called the Urim, and so we'll see kind of that later too. But later, of course, the prophet would be one of the you can say spiritual advisors to Israel. So verse 22, it says, Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and he took Joshua, had him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire community, and laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord had spoken through Moses. So again, this is something that, as I said, that is always important, for leadership. And of course, today there's a lot of, in my opinion, just bad leadership in churches. Sometimes you see when especially with you see this mostly with independent churches. You see it some with denominational church, but mostly independent churches, because independent churches kind of are their own entity. So they're not necessarily answering to anyone. But I don't know why this here. Okay. So all right. I was trying to look up something, but anyway, so now the transfer of authority. Joshua would lead the people. Now, of course, we're going to see, and we'll get more into it when we get to the book of Joshua, how that the book of Joshua itself is his leadership. And Joshua's primary ministry. Now you will see that different people have in the Bible. You see that different men have different purposes, right? Different callings. And really their focus is on those callings. And when it says that they did everything that the Lord had commanded them. Well, one of the things that it was what their calling was. Kind of like what was their calling. And so like, for example, Abraham's calling was to have Isaac. Noah's calling was to build the boat, right? That was Noah's calling. David was to be king, okay? And we can just go on and on and on. Solomon was to build the temple. Now, Moses, of course, was to deliver the people, give them the law. Had he not sinned, he would have brought them into the land. But Joshua's purpose would be to bring them into the land and then establish them in the land. So throughout, we'll see different men who have different purposes, and they will fulfill those purposes. Joshua would be one of the more faithful leaders. Moses was faithful. Moses got angry, made a mistake that cost him. But Joshua would be faithful, one of the ones who were just a great leader. He's going to be just a fantastic leader. And so basically now what we see is kind of the setting up of the leadership, the elders of the new generation as they go into the land, which will end up from this perspective would just be in a couple of weeks. All right. I'll see you in chapter 28. See you next time. Okay.